June 22nd, 1941. As the sun rose over Eastern Europe, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Tanks rolled forward, aircraft filled the skies, and artillery opened fire across a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. It was the largest military invasion in human history. German leaders believed that within a few months the Soviet Union would collapse. After all, Germany had crushed Poland in weeks and defeated France in just 6 weeks. The German army seemed unstoppable, and many believed the Soviet Union would be the next easy victory. At the center of this confidence were Germany's famous generals. Commanders like Guderian, Manstein, and others had built a reputation for brilliant military planning. Their armies moved faster than any army had moved before. Their tactics combined tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry into a powerful fighting force that the world would later call Blitzkrieg. During the opening months of the invasion, everything appeared to go according to plan. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers surrendered. German newspapers celebrated victory after victory, and many German officers believed the war would be over before winter. But beneath these spectacular victories, a problem was already emerging. German generals were winning battles, yet they were fighting a war that could not be won through battlefield brilliance alone. Every mile they advanced pushed them deeper into Soviet territory. Supply lines became longer. Trucks carried fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts across terrible roads. Vehicles broke down constantly. Horses, which still pulled much of Germany's logistics network, struggled to keep pace with the advancing army. The faster Germany advanced, the harder it became to support its own troops. The Soviet Union was unlike any enemy Germany had faced before. France was relatively compact. Poland was much smaller. The Soviet Union seemed endless. German soldiers often joked that every time they reached a new objective, they discovered another 1,000 miles waiting beyond it. Even after capturing enormous areas of territory, the Germans found that the Soviet Union still possessed vast reserves of land, resources, and manpower. As German armies pushed toward Moscow, they continued to destroy Soviet forces on a massive scale. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the first months of the invasion. By any normal military standard, such losses should have ended the war. Yet the Soviet Union kept fighting. New armies appeared, new defensive lines were established, new tanks arrived at the front. German officers could hardly believe what they were seeing. Every time they thought the Red Army had reached its limit, another Soviet force emerged. One reason was the Soviet Union's enormous population. Germany simply could not match Soviet manpower. Even after suffering catastrophic losses, the Soviet government continued mobilizing millions of new soldiers. Entire generations were called into military service. Factories switched to wartime production. Civilians worked endless hours supporting the war effort. The Soviet state was willing to endure losses on a scale that shocked even experienced German commanders. But manpower alone does not win wars. Weapons, ammunition, fuel, and equipment are equally important. Here, Germany faced another challenge that its generals could not solve. As German forces advanced eastward, Soviet authorities began one of the most extraordinary industrial operations in history. Thousands of factories were dismantled piece by piece. Machinery was loaded onto trains. Workers and engineers traveled east beyond the Ural Mountains, far away from German bombers. Entire industrial centers were relocated. The Germans expected these factories to be lost forever. Instead, many resumed production within months. Soon, Soviet factories were producing enormous quantities of tanks, artillery, trucks, and aircraft. Some German officers were stunned to discover that despite destroying thousands of Soviet tanks, even more kept appearing on the battlefield. The Soviet Union had transformed itself into a giant war machine. Meanwhile, Germany's own industrial situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Germany lacked many critical resources needed for a long war. Oil was especially important. Modern armies depended on fuel for tanks, trucks, aircraft, and mechanized units. Every offensive operation consumed enormous quantities of fuel. As the war continued, Germany struggled to replace losses and maintain supplies. Even the best military plans become useless when tanks cannot move and aircraft cannot fly. As 1941 drew to a close, German troops approached Moscow. Many believed victory was within reach. Then winter arrived. For decades, people have claimed that winter alone defeated Germany. The truth is more complicated. Winter certainly caused suffering. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, vehicles malfunctioned, weapons jammed, soldiers suffered frostbite. However, winter did not create Germany's problems. It exposed problems that already existed. Supply shortages, logistical failures, and unrealistic planning had weakened the German army long before the first snowfall. While Germany struggled, the Soviet Union was learning. The Red Army of 1943 was not the same army that had been shocked by the invasion in 1941. Soviet commanders studied German tactics carefully. They learned from their mistakes. Training improved. Communication improved. Coordination between infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft improved dramatically. The Soviet military became more skilled and more confident with each passing year. German commanders noticed the difference. Early in the war, Soviet units often reacted slowly and made costly mistakes. Later, Soviet operations became increasingly sophisticated. Large offensives were planned with remarkable precision. Massive artillery bombardments softened German positions before attacks began. Soviet intelligence gathered valuable information about German deployments. The Red Army was evolving into a highly effective fighting force. Nothing demonstrated this transformation better than the Battle of Stalingrad. What began as a German offensive turned into one of the greatest disasters in military history. German forces fought fiercely and captured much of the city. Yet their success created a dangerous weakness. As they pushed into Stalingrad, their flanks were protected by weaker Allied forces. Soviet commanders recognized the opportunity. Rather than attacking the strongest German units directly, they struck the vulnerable flanks. The result was devastating. Soviet forces surrounded an entire German army. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped. Despite desperate efforts to break out, the encircled force eventually surrendered. The defeat shocked Germany and inspired the Soviet Union. For the first time, many people realized that Germany could actually lose the war. After Stalingrad, German generals hoped to regain the initiative. They believed one major victory could change the course of the war. This hope led to the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history. German commanders carefully prepared the offensive, believing it could destroy Soviet forces and restore momentum. The Soviets, however, knew the attack was coming. They constructed enormous defensive positions filled with trenches, minefields, anti-tank weapons, and artillery. When German forces attacked, they encountered defenses unlike anything they had seen before. Fighting was intense, and casualties were heavy. Although German troops demonstrated tremendous skill and courage, they could not achieve a decisive breakthrough. Kursk marked a turning point. After the battle, Germany increasingly lost the ability to launch large-scale offensives in the east. The strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. From that moment onward, German armies spent most of their time reacting to Soviet attacks rather than planning their own. Another factor often discussed is Hitler's interference in military operations. Many German generals later argued that they could have won if Hitler had listened to their advice. There is some truth to this claim. Hitler frequently overruled experienced commanders. He often refused tactical withdrawals and insisted on holding positions that could not be defended. These decisions caused unnecessary losses. However, blaming everything on Hitler oversimplifies the situation. Even if every German general had received complete freedom, Germany would still have faced enormous disadvantages. The Soviet Union possessed greater manpower, greater industrial capacity, and greater strategic depth. Germany also faced growing pressure from the Western Allies, whose bombing campaigns damaged German industry and infrastructure. Resources that might have been used against the Soviet Union had to be diverted elsewhere. By 1944, the outcome of the war was becoming clear. Soviet armies launched massive offensives that shattered German positions across Eastern Europe. Entire German formations disappeared. Cities that Germany had captured years earlier were retaken one after another. The Red Army pushed steadily westward, growing stronger while Germany grew weaker. German generals continued demonstrating tactical skill throughout the war. Many defensive operations were conducted with remarkable effectiveness. Smaller German forces often delayed much larger Soviet armies. Yet delaying defeat is not the same as preventing it. Every battle consumed resources Germany could not replace. Every retreat brought Soviet forces closer to Berlin. In the final months of the war, Soviet armies entered Germany itself. The same country that German leaders had expected to conquer in a few months now stood on German soil. Berlin was surrounded. After the failure at Kursk and the constant pressure on the Eastern Front, Germany's situation was no longer stable. The Soviet Union was not just defending anymore. It was now building momentum for a full-scale counteroffensive. German generals could clearly see it, but they also understood something even more important. They were running out of time. By 1944, the Red Army had transformed into a completely different force. It was larger, better equipped, and far more coordinated than ever before. Soviet offensives were now carefully planned operations involving thousands of tanks, heavy artillery, and air support working together. German defenses, on the other hand, were stretched thin across an enormous front line that they could no longer properly hold. One of the most important Soviet operations of the war was Operation Bagration. This massive attack targeted the German Army Group Center in Belarus. What made this operation so devastating was not just its size, but its precision. The Soviets used deception tactics to mislead German intelligence, making them believe the main attack would come elsewhere. When the offensive began, German forces were completely overwhelmed. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed. In just a few weeks, Germany lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and vast amounts of equipment. Army Group Center, once one of Germany's strongest formations, was almost completely wiped out. This single operation marked one of the worst defeats in German military history. At this stage of the war, German generals understood a painful reality. No matter how skilled they were on the battlefield, they could no longer replace what they were losing. Every tank destroyed by the Soviets was difficult to replace. Every trained soldier lost could not be easily recovered. Every retreat meant giving up territory that could not be reclaimed. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to grow stronger with support from its massive industrial base and allied supply programs. Trucks, food, weapons, and raw materials flowed into the Soviet war effort, increasing its ability to conduct large-scale operations deep into Eastern Europe. The gap between the two sides was widening every month. German commanders tried to slow the advance using defensive lines, fortified positions, and counterattacks. In some areas, they succeeded in delaying Soviet progress. But these were only temporary pauses. The Red Army was no longer making reckless attacks. It was systematically pushing forward, breaking German defenses step by step. By late 1944, Soviet forces had reached the borders of Germany's pre-war territory. Cities that once seemed far from the front line were now directly threatened. German civilians began experiencing the war in a way they had never expected. Air raids intensified, refugees fled westward, and panic spread across the country. Inside the German high command, discussions became increasingly desperate. Some officers still believed in defensive miracles, but most understood that the war was now lost. The only question left was how long Germany could continue resisting. Even in this final stage, German generals continued to demonstrate tactical skill. They organized defensive withdrawals, delayed Soviet advances, and occasionally launched local counterattacks that inflicted heavy casualties. But these actions could no longer change the outcome. They were only slowing down the inevitable collapse. As Soviet forces moved deeper into Eastern Europe, the scale of destruction increased. Entire German armies were trapped and destroyed in pockets of resistance. The Red Army used encirclement tactics similar to those Germany had once used successfully in 1941. But now the roles were reversed. By early 1945, the Soviet Union was preparing for the final assault on Berlin. Germany was exhausted, isolated, and out of resources. The same generals who once planned rapid offensives across Europe were now fighting a defensive war inside their own homeland. The fall of Berlin was no longer a question of if, only when.